What if I told you you can make a drum kit out of all of your favorite drums, which can create new combinations of those drums with the press of a button, and also have knobs that can create entirely new drums out of all the drums already in the rack, all while barely using any CPU. So this is what I call the sketch kit, which I'm going to show you how to make today. So this is for when you want to quickly write an idea in Ableton, but you don't want to spend your creative energy trying to curate samples at the beginning of the project when you want to get an idea down. So the idea is that you just load up this kit at the start of a project and press the random button, and it'll choose a random assortment of your favorite kicks, snares, hi-hats, 808s, whatever you want to load this up with. So this doesn't just choose all the samples. If you have this auto select arrow on and you have your device view open, it'll show whatever pad you have selected, which you can load these individual pad racks with macros that'll completely change the sample. Which can show you how much variation you can get out of just using one sample. So imagine how many combinations that'd be when you have 128 samples per pad. And in addition, these are all super compatible with push, so you can use this wheel to randomize macros from here. And you can also have the same auto select on, so you can have your like inner rack selected and also use the randomize button. So how I make this is you obviously get a drum rack, and I recommend doing this with your absolute favorite samples, like shit that you always use, shit that you know works and sounds good in context of whatever you usually make. Just know that sample selection is key, but just for demonstration to show how far you can get with using all stock tools, I'm just going to use stock Ableton samples. So in the samples tab, I'm just going to filter for one shot. I think I'm going to start with snares. Then I can select the creator to be Ableton. So it's just going to show Ableton samples. And if you have the space on your computer, you can go to this packs tab and download all these different packs. A lot of them have like drum clips or max devices or just individual drum samples. So stuff like drum booth or like trap drums can get you a lot of extra samples and drum clips and whatever. So you want to start out by dragging any sample into the drum rack. And from there, it's going to load in a sampler. But in order to efficiently use this sample selecting method, we want to change this to sampler and open up this zone section. So this is a section where you can choose when certain samples are played. So say if I drag in like at least like 128 samples and I turn on this round robin, for example, it's going to play a different sample every time, but in like a sequential order. So you can have it be forward, backward, every other sample, or random. And you can have it reset every bar or whatever. But we're not going to use this today. We're going to be using these sample selection tabs. So if you didn't know, there's 3 different types. There's key, which incoming MIDI notes will determine what sample is played, so you can distribute ranges equally. And this is going to play the same sample every time in this case, since we're just playing in a drum rack. There's velocity, which plays different samples depending on like how hard you're hitting. But we want to use this selector mode, which lets us pick using this blue bar up here. So we can Command A select all of these and distribute ranges equally. And since I dragged in more than 128, I'm going to want to delete all of the samples that are kind of hugging 128 over here. Then I'm going to want to Command G, group this into its own instrument rack. And then in the selector tab, we want to map the blue bar to macro 1. So this chooses what sample is going to be played. And then we can map that to an outer macro and just call this snare select, which is going to be the basis of how we're going to be selecting samples. So now we can close this zone section, and if you want this to use less CPU, then I would recommend turning on this RAM button over here. So this might save a little bit of CPU if you're using these in like a heavy project. So now I want some macros that kind of shape the sample more. I'm going to turn off this filter section. And for kicks and snares, I usually don't like to have velocity control volume, but that's just a personal preference. Now I'm going to set the volume to be like -3. But what's cool is that you can use the ADSR in these to kind of be a transient shaper in a way. So in this loop dropdown, we can change it to be trigger mode. So every time we press the pad, it's going to trigger the entire sample. And since these are snares and we want the transient, we're not going to be using the attack to kind of fade like this. We're going to turn up this initial. So when we turn up the attack, it'll kind of create like a plateau. So we can map this to a macro. And this sustain is going to act as our like transient emphasis. So say I turn on the decay. We're already kind of turning the snare into like a percussion sound. So we're also going to want to map decay and sustain. And I like to limit the ranges of these since we're not going to want like an initial punch of longer than maybe like 100 milliseconds, maybe 200 if we're being generous. And then decay probably doesn't need to be shorter than 50 milliseconds. Maybe 2 seconds is pretty generous. And something that's cool about sampler is that there's this global time knob down here. So this controls the attack, decay, and release all at once. So we can map this to a macro. as kind of like a one knob like transient control, but you'll still need to control the sustain. And another parameter that can completely refresh samples is a transpose knob. So we can map this to a macro. And I feel like you have a lot of wiggle room from snares. So we can do like -12 to 24. This is already so many more snare possibilities out of one sample. And when you randomize stuff in racks, you can actually choose some of these macros to not randomize. So global time is something that I would always want to control myself. So I'm going to exclude this macro from randomization. And another kind of underrated way you can get new samples out of existing ones is by changing the start point of the samples. And Sampler doesn't have a dedicated control for mapping a start point to a macro, so we kind of have to make a makeshift one. So in this MIDI tab, you might be familiar with the sample offset technique. So a lot of people use velocity, map that to sample offset. So say if you get a velocity device and you have it on fixed mode, you can kind of use this output knob to choose where the sample starts. But the problem is a lot of people like to use velocity on their drums. So instead of velocity, we can choose either slide or pressure, which are these MPE controls. So if you have like push or something, that's when you slide up and down. So we can map slide to sample offset. And then we can get this stock MPE control max device and then group this into its own rack. And then on the slide section, we can map the minimum to a macro and the maximum to that same macro. And then save that so we can use that whenever. So now we move this up and down. You can hear we're changing the start point. But you also notice there's this snap button that's default to on. So this will minimize kind of clicks and pops, which you won't hear as much if you're doing this with snares, but you'll hear it more with kicks. So maybe we can have an option to turn off snap, and then we can also map the sample start. And since a lot of these snare samples have like silent ends, we can restrict this range to be a lot shorter. Now let's get some more macros and add some processing so we can make snares a lot more roomy with reverbs. We don't need too many options, so it might be nice to have like size and dry wet. And then drum bus has this transient knob. So when you push it up, it'll kind of emphasize the initial transient, which can kind of hurt your ears. But when you bring this knob down, it'll kind of shorten the decay, which sounds cool after the reverb because you're also transient shaping the reverb. So I like to have this transient knob mapped, and I'll want to limit this to be -1 to 0, maybe -50 or -60 to 0, depending on how snappy you want your snares to be. And I like to map this damp knob just in case you have like really tinny snares. So like if you have your transpose up and you kind of want to remove some high end. So I might limit that from 2K to 12K. And in my rack pack, I have this beefilator rack, which does what the name says, it kind of beefs up drums and kind of rounds them off. So I might put like the glue compressor threshold and saturate dry wet. So now let's see what this sounds like when we randomize it. Keep in mind, this is all the same sample. We haven't even moved this sample selector knob. And then once you finish making a rack you're satisfied with, you can press the save button. And usually whenever I get a new sample pack or something, I'll load like all of the snares into one selector kit and then save that so I can swap out this in any new selector rack I might make. But now I'm going to hold option on this and move this to C1. I'm going to make this our kick selector. I'm just going to get rid of all of the effects. And then we can go into zone and delete everything. So now I'm going to filter for kick samples. I'm gonna do a lot of these trap drums. Then we want to do the same thing as earlier, select all the samples and distribute ranges equally. And I'm gonna want to kind of reconfigure some of these knobs like transpose. I don't think I'd want to have a kick pitched down too much or also pitched up. I might have it go from like -5 to -7. And for changing the start point, I think we're always going to want to have snap on. And a trick I like to do with kicks a lot is that you can kind of emphasize like the transients more with a pitch envelope. So I might have the amount at like 48 for shits and gigs. And then we can use this peak parameter right here to change it whenever we want. So we can map that to a macro and then we can change that to be 0 to 100. That might be too extreme now that I'm thinking about it, so I might change it to be like 0 to 33. And we can map the decay and make that be like 1 to 200. And you can kind of hear we're adding some slight extra punch. And something else that could be kind of cool is using this shaper section of Sampler. So there's these 4 modes. And I think soft works best for kicks, but I do want to show something where you can use the other modes later. Then we can also get drum bus again. And then for beefilator, I might just have an on-off and drive linked to the same macro. So a cool like rack hack you can do is if you want to have like an on off, you can set the minimum to 1 and max to 0. So whenever this knob is at 0, the entire rack will be off. But then once I move it, the rack will turn on, and then I can gradually turn up the drive. I think we got a cool foundation. I'm going to duplicate the snare rack, replacing all the snares with claps. Do the same thing with rims. And then for hi-hats, I have a cool method, so I'm going to start from scratch for this one. So I'm still going to make this a sampler, but in the zone section, instead of choosing our hats by selector, I want to choose by key. And you might think, well, this is a drum rack, so how are you going to select by key? So first, I'm just going to distribute ranges equally. And in this case, we want to use pitch to select our hi-hat. I want to make sure the filter's off. Let's group this into a rack, map the pitch to a macro, and then let's make our minimum -60 and our maximum 68. And before I show why we moved to the key selector for this, let's map some ADSR, but this time I do want to have attack, just so we can kind of turn some hats into shakers or something. Also map decay, also map sustain. And then let's also have a global time knob. And something that I think is kind of cool to do with hi-hats is kind of combine a bunch of them to be like a multi-textural hi-hat. So we can get the chord device, and there's all these different chord presets. And when we strum this, we have an expressive kind of like hi-hat flare. So I made a rack that just basically has all of the chord presets chosen through its chain selector. This is in my rack pack, but basically we can have a chord selector and a strum pattern, and you can choose whether you want to have tension and crescendo also mapped. And then I'll limit the strum to be like -50 to 50. Something else I like to have for hats specifically is random pan option. Also forgot to map transpose. Let's do -12 to 12. And then pitch envelope can also be kind of fun for these. And then I'd also like to duplicate these racks and maybe just like not have the chord section and choose a bunch of hi-hats that I didn't choose earlier. I think it's just nice to have 3 different kind of hat options, or maybe even more. And then for one of them, I would get an arpeggiator, maybe have it on like quarter notes or something. Now I think I want to do some 808s, so I think I'm going to copy the kick rack, and I'm going to remove the sample start kind of stuff. I'm going to get rid of all the kick samples. And I also think I'm going to set the initial back and get rid of the attack, then change that to release, and I'm going to get rid of the trigger mode. Now I'm going to drag in a bunch of 808s. And I think 808s are a super cool example for how you can use these shaper modes. So we can have macro 9 be the shaper drive. So if you're adding your own 808s from sample packs, you're going to need to make sure you change the root note to make sure that they match. I recommend just doing this with a tuner. And then this won't work for all samples, but it can be cool to have the reverse back and forth on. And then there's this device that I'm working on that'll be out very soon called Chord Sauce. And I think it'd be cool to use this as like a scale-aware way to make the 808 always be in key. So this has a solo bass section. And we can use a pitch right before it, map that to a macro to make it select which chord it's playing. So in our main drum rack, we can make the pitch be 0 to 11. And with the same concept, we can also have a chord stab. So I'm going to move these to a new chain. I'm going to unsolo the bass, turn off the bass. Maybe I'll also duplicate this 808 chain to this new chain, but I'm going to get rid of like the drum bus, beefilator, shaper drive. And there's not too many stock samples that have this, so you might find these in sample packs or have to make your own, but I'm just going to look up C3. You can drag all these in. Now we can kind of have an easy chord stab, but you could have this chord voicing knob. Kind of change the inversion, and then I can also make it be a ninth. If you wanted to have bass, you could. And these kind of samples are where I like to have the sustain mode on and then have them like loop back and forth. Might be cool to also include filter and filter envelopes. As far as effects go, you can add anything like maybe like EQ, reverb. Some other kind of random ideas you can do to fill up the rest of this rack. I have a saved voice search in my sidebar, so if you go to the samples tab and filter for one shot, voice, and you can filter by like solo, synth, vocal, speech, whatever. Damn. You can save this as a search result and save it as like voice. I might just have like speech or something.
Thanks, house. Thanks.
These might be like super random. I'm just going to drag a bunch in here.
Thanks.
No.
Maybe it'd be cool to have like a shifter for like ad-lib type things. There's so many possibilities with this. I think I'm going to show 2 more types of selectors. So I think it's cool to drag a bunch of different like sample pack like bass stabs into the zone selector. And also use the shaper section. And I also have the same pitch and chord sauce just for picking the bass to be in scale. And something else that's kind of underrated in sampler is this FM section. So you can make completely new samples out of these other womps as well. And I like to just top this off with my bass enhancer for my rack pack. I might just have like the dry wet as like one of the knobs. I also made this like Foley selector. This is all with like splice samples, and it also has like the chord multi-pattern kind of shit. So you can kind of use the same technique with like the first hat we made and kind of have this be like a snare enhancer. And in the modulation section, you can have like randomly like change the pitch. And then finally, there's this routing section. So if you wanted, you can have everything sidechained to your kick and snare, like especially like the 808s and stabs and stuff. So I might have these audio to this compressor. Then I might make these kick, snare, clap, rim output to this sidechain trigger. And on the actual sidechain, we can take the source to be from the sidechain trigger. And then we can like super high pass it. So now you have a built-in sidechain to your rack too. And one other thing, you have a drum bus. And if you didn't want to have like a sidechain, you have everything output to like a drum bus saturator type deal. So you could have like bass shaper. If you wanted to kind of give your whole rack a flavor. Or you could even get my multi-shaper device and map it to like the chords and Foley. Maybe have it like a super slow rate. That's all I have for this video. I hope at least one or more of these techniques inspired you to do something. Maybe with a drum rack, maybe making your own sketch kit. Consider getting my Max Devices rack packs. I have so much stuff coming soon that I can't wait to share.